The door I meant to reach was 3 feet to the left, and I did not find that out until I had already slammed the wrong one shut behind me against a wind that wanted to take it off its hinges. I stood there dripping snow onto a stranger's floor, my chest heaving, my fingers too numb to feel the latch I had just thrown, and a man rose from a chair by the fire as though I had woken him out of some private thought rather than out of sleep. "That door," he said, not unkindly, "belongs to my room." "Then I am sorry," I said, "but I am not going back out there to find the right one." He looked at me for a long moment, not the look of a man deciding whether to be angry, but the look of a man recalculating an evening he had thought was already decided. Then, astonishingly, he almost smiled. "No," he agreed, "I don't suppose you are." The way station at Berlin was little more than a cluster of cabins built into the shoulder of the mountain pass, meant for travelers caught between one valley and the next when the weather turned, as the weather in that country was famous for doing without warning or mercy. I had been 3 hours from the nearest village when the storm came down off the peaks like something with a grudge, and by the time I saw the low roofline through the white, I could not have told you which cabin was the common house, and which were let out to whoever paid the coin. I had simply run for the nearest door and thrown my whole weight against it. Now I stood dripping in a stranger's private room, and the stranger was watching me with an expression I could not yet read, and outside the wind screamed like something grieving. "I'll go," I said, though my legs did not seem inclined to agree with me. "You will do no such thing." He said it plainly, the way a man states a fact about the weather, and crossed to a chest by the wall to draw out a blanket worn soft with age, the sort of thing a man keeps because it is his and not because it is fine. "There is one fire lit in this whole miserable place tonight, traveler, and it is mine, and I am not cruel enough to send anyone back into that for the sake of a locked door." He held the blanket out. I took it because my hands had stopped arguing with me about pride some minutes before, and I sat where he gestured, on the bench nearest the flames, and for a moment neither of us said anything at all. "Nessa," I offered, when the silence had gone on long enough to feel like a debt. "Dorian." He said it simply, no title attached, the way a man says a name he has not had many chances to use plainly in a long while. He settled back into his own chair, an arm's length away, and did not ask anything further, and I found that I liked him for it, for not demanding the whole shape of my life in exchange for his fire. The cabin was small and close and smelled of pine smoke and melted snow, one window gone white and blind with frost, one door, the right one, I now understood, leading out to a corridor I had missed entirely in the dark. A kettle hung near the flames. A pack sat by the wall, plain leather, unmarked by any crest or color, the pack of a man who traveled light and did not care to be remembered by his belongings. "You're not a local," I said, because his voice carried a shape to its vowels that did not belong to this valley. "No," he agreed. "I'm passing through, same as you, only I had the good fortune of picking the correct door." "You had the good fortune of the door being labeled correctly in your own memory," I said. "I have never been to Berlin before in my life. I didn't even know there were 2 cabins so close together." "There are 4, he said. "This is the smallest and coldest, which is why I have it entirely to myself, and why you are welcome to half of it for the night, since you have already claimed half of it without my permission." I laughed before I could stop myself, a short surprised sound, and he looked pleased in a way that seemed to surprise him as much as it surprised me. "You don't look at me the way most men look at a woman who has just fallen through their door in the middle of the night," I said, studying him properly now that the worst of the cold had loosened its grip on my thinking. "Most men would already be deciding what my arrival owed them." "Should I be deciding that?" "No. I am only telling you that you are unusual, and I have not yet decided whether to trust it." "Then don't decide yet," he said. "Wait until morning. If I am still behaving myself by first light, you may trust it freely, and if I am not, you will have lost nothing but a night's sleep you were likely to lose to the storm regardless. That is a very reasonable bargain for a man who has already given away half his fire. I find reasonable bargains keep a man honest, he said, in a way that grand promises never do. Anyone can swear an oath by firelight. Fewer men can simply behave decently for 8 hours running, and let the behaving speak for itself. I had no answer to that which did not sound like agreement, so I let it stand, and pulled the blanket a little closer, and watched the fire instead of him for a moment, though I could feel him watching me all the same, not unkindly, the way one watches something one is glad simply to have in the room. The wind threw itself against the shutters. Somewhere farther off a shutter that was not so well latched banged twice and went still, and I flinched at the sound, and he noticed the flinch and did not comment on it, only reached to feed another length of wood into the fire so that the light climbed higher and warmer between us. "You're traveling alone in a blizzard," he said after a while, "which tells me either you are very foolish or you had no better choice. I don't think you are foolish. I had a wagon and 2 companions until this afternoon, when the wagon lost a wheel on the pass road, and my companions decided the sensible thing was to wait with it for morning. I held my hands nearer the flames, feeling the numbness start to burn its way back into feeling. I decided the sensible thing was to reach shelter before the storm swallowed the road markers, because I have seen what happens to travelers who wait on open ground in this kind of weather, and I did not care to test my own luck against it. "That isn't foolish," he said. "That's a woman who trusts her own judgment over a crowd's comfort. It's rarer than you'd think. You say that as though you've made a study of it." "I have made a study of very little else most days." Something flickered behind his eyes when he said it, some private weight he did not explain, and he did not elaborate, and I did not press, because the fire was warm and the wind was loud, and it did not yet feel like my business to ask a stranger what burdens he carried into a snowbound cabin at the edge of a mountain pass. We talked instead of smaller things, of the road I had traveled from the lowland towns, of a market fair I had once seen where a man had trained 6 geese to walk in a straight line for coin, of the particular ache of standing all day at a loom, which was my trade, weaving cloth for a merchant house that undervalued the hands that made its fortune. He listened the way few men had ever listened to me, without waiting for his turn to speak, without steering the talk back toward himself, and when he did speak of himself it came sideways, in observations rather than declarations. A man who had seen more of grief than a man his age should have, who chose his words like a man accustomed to being measured by every one of them, and had grown careful as a result. "You choose your words the way a man does who has been misquoted once too often," I said. "That's a shrewd thing to notice. I weave cloth for a living. I notice when a thread has been pulled tight in one place and left slack in another." I studied him over the firelight. "You do that. You'll speak 3 sentences of easy honesty and then go quiet exactly when the 4th sentence might tell me something real." He was quiet again then, but it was a different quiet, considering, not evasive. "There are things I am not free to say to a stranger I met through the wrong door of a cabin," he said at last. "Not because I don't trust you. Because they aren't only mine to tell." "That's fair," I said, and meant it, and something in his shoulders eased, as though he had expected an argument and been given grace instead. "Most people push," he said quietly. "When I tell them there's a wall, they spend the rest of the evening trying to find the door in it. You're the first in longer than I can remember who simply let the wall be a wall." "Perhaps I've built a few of my own," I said, "and I know how tiresome it is to have someone rattle at them for sport." "Have you built walls, I mean?" "A few, small ones. Nothing so grand as whatever you're carrying. Mine are mostly just old disappointments stacked up like firewood, kept close in case the cold comes back." I shrugged, though the gesture came out smaller than I meant it, almost shy. "I don't often say that aloud either." "Then we are even," he said. Two travelers with our various walls, sharing one fire between us, and asking nothing further than that the other simply be present. That sounds like a fine arrangement for one snowbound night. It does, he agreed, and something in the way he said it made me wonder even then, before I understood anything of what was happening between us, whether one night was truly all either of us intended it to be. It was somewhere in that easing, in that small, unlooked-for gift of my not pressing him, that I first felt it, not the sweep of feeling one reads about in old songs, nothing so grand as that, but a small, persistent warmth low in my wrist, like a coal banked under ash, patient and real and entirely unfamiliar. I rubbed at it without thinking, the way one rubs at an old scar in cold weather, and did not yet understand what it was, only that it had arrived precisely when he softened toward me, and that it did not fade when I looked away from him toward the fire. He noticed me rubbing my wrist and something crossed his face, quick, startled, quickly smoothed away. But he said nothing of it, and I said nothing of the warmth either, because I did not have words for it yet, only the sense that some private clock inside me had begun, for the first time in my life, to keep a different time. "Tell me something true," I said instead, to fill the space before either of us could ask the other about it. "Not a pleasantry, something you don't often say." He considered this, with the seriousness of a man being asked to hand over something valuable. "I am tired," he said finally, "of being useful to everyone and unknown to anyone. I have spent so many years being what people need me to be that I have started to forget what I am when no one needs anything from me at all." He looked into the fire rather than at me when he said it, as though the words were easier to release into the flames than into the room. "Tonight, for the first time in longer than I can easily count, no one needs anything from me. I find I don't quite know what to do with the quiet." "You could talk to the woman who broke into your room," I offered. That won the smile back, easier this time, warmer. "I could indeed." "Then it's your turn to ask me something true." He studied me for a moment, and there was nothing predatory in the study, nothing that made me want to draw the blanket tighter, only a careful, searching attention, as if he were trying to see past what I said to what I meant. "What do you want, Nessa, that you have never once said aloud to anybody?" The fire popped. The wind found some new gap in the shutters and moaned through it. I thought about lying, the way one does out of long habit, some small, comfortable evasion, and then did not. "I want to matter to someone," I said, "not for what I can do for them, but simply because I exist in front of them. I have spent my whole life being useful, a good worker, a reliable neighbor, a woman who never causes trouble. I don't think anyone has ever looked at me and wanted nothing from me at all." "I am looking at you right now," he said quietly, "and I promise you I want nothing from you, only this, only the talking." The coal in my wrist flared warm enough that I nearly gasped, and across the small space between us, he went very still, his hand drifting to his own wrist as though something there had answered mine, though neither of us yet had the language to name what had passed between us, only the shared and startled quiet of two people who have just felt the same impossible thing at the same impossible moment, and have no idea what it means. "Did you feel that?" I said, before I could think better of asking. "I don't know what I felt," he said low, "but I felt something, and it came from you, or it came towards you, and I have never in my life felt anything like it." We sat with that mystery between us instead of trying to solve it, because the night was long and the storm showed no sign of relenting, and there was a strange, unhurried comfort in not needing to understand a thing immediately in order to let it be true. "Does it happen to you often?" I asked, when the quiet had stretched long enough that I needed to fill it with something. "This feeling of not understanding your own body?" "Never," he said. "I am, as a rule, an exceedingly well-ordered man. I know precisely what I am at any given hour of any given day, and I have not been surprised by myself in longer than I care to admit. This is the first time in a great many years that I have sat somewhere and simply not known what was happening to me, And stranger still, I find I am not troubled by not knowing. I would have expected to be troubled. I am not. Perhaps not everything needs solving the moment it appears. That is a very forgiving way to look at the world. It's the only way I've found that doesn't exhaust a person, I said. I spent a great many years trying to solve every strange feeling the moment it arrived, turning it over and over until I'd worn it smooth, and all I ever managed was to frighten the feeling away before I'd properly understood it. I've since decided some things are better left to sit a while, the way bread must sit before it rises properly. You can't rush a thing like that without ruining it. A weaver's patience again, he said, something fond creeping into his voice. You keep circling back to it without seeming to notice you're doing it. It's the only patience I own. I might as well use it on more than just cloth. He smiled at that, a slower smile than the others, one that seemed to start somewhere behind his eyes before it ever reached his mouth. And for a moment neither of us needed to say anything further, the fire cracking and settling between us, the wind outside beginning, almost imperceptibly, to lose some of its earlier fury. The hours passed the way hours do only in the deep of winter nights, slow and rich, and strangely outside of time. He told me of a brother he had lost to a border skirmish years past, and how the grief of it had taught him to hold everyone he loved a little more carefully, a little more urgently, as though love itself were a candle that could gutter without warning. I told him of my mother, who had raised me alone after my father's boat went down in a spring flood, and how she had taught me to weave not as a trade, but as a kind of prayer, each pass of the shuttle a small act of patience in a world that rarely rewarded patience with anything at all. She sounds like a remarkable woman, he said. She would have liked you, I said, and was surprised to find I meant it. This stranger I had known for only a handful of hours, this man whose title and history and true shape in the world I did not yet know, and who I felt nonetheless that I had somehow always been walking toward. At some point, he made tea from the kettle over the fire, strong and plain, and pressed a cup into my hands with a care that made the simple act feel larger than it was, and I wrapped my numbed fingers around the warmth of it, and thought that I had never in my life been handed a cup of tea as though it were a gift, rather than a task completed. You do that, I said. Do what? Make small things feel important. The tea, the blanket, even just listening. You make it feel like it costs you something to give, which makes it feel like it's worth more. Everything costs something to give, he said. The people who don't understand that are the ones who give carelessly, and carelessness is its own kind of insult, however it's dressed up. He turned the empty kettle in his hands, considering it as though it held an answer. I have watched a great many people give gifts they did not mean, Nessa. I would rather give you a cup of tea and mean it than give you gold and not. I would rather have the tea, I said, and he laughed, a real laugh, low and startled out of him, as though I had said something funnier than I'd intended. There was a man once, I said, before I quite decided to say it, who courted me for the better part of a year and brought me ribbons from the coast towns and fine soap that smelled of lavender, and never once asked me a question about myself that required more than a nod to answer. I thought for a long while that the ribbons meant he loved me. It took me longer than I would like to admit to understand that a man can bring you gifts for years and still never once actually see you. What became of him? He married a woman who wanted ribbons. I don't say that unkindly. I hope they are both very happy. I only learned from it that being given things is not the same as being known, and I had confused the two for far too long because no one had ever shown me the difference. I turned my cup slowly in my hands. You've shown me the difference in one evening, and you didn't even have to try very hard. That unsettles me a little if I'm honest. Why should it unsettle you? Because it makes me wonder what else I've mistaken for love all these years, simply because it was the only shape of attention I was ever offered. He was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke again his voice had gone careful, The way a man's voice goes when he is handling something he suspects might be fragile. I don't think you were foolish for mistaking it. I think you were simply patient with poor material, the way a good weaver is patient with a bad thread, hoping the pattern will improve further down the cloth. That isn't a fault in you. It's a mercy you kept extending to people who didn't always deserve it. That's a kind way to put it. I have found, he said, that the unkind way is rarely the true way. People mistake cruelty for honesty far too often. I don't care for the confusion. You speak as though you've had cause to know a great many unkind people. I have had cause to know a great many people who mistook themselves for kind, he said, which is a different and, I think, more dangerous thing. The cruel ones are at least honest about what they are. It's the ones who believe themselves generous while never once asking what the person in front of them actually needed. Those are the ones that leave the deeper marks. I have tried, most of my life, not to become one of them, and I do not always know if I have succeeded. You gave a half-frozen stranger your only fire and your only blanket without asking a single thing in return, I said. I would call that a fair start. You give me too much credit. Any decent man would have done the same. Any decent man would like to think so, I said. Far fewer of them actually do it in my experience. I have known men who would have made me beg for that blanket first, just to feel the shape of their own generosity a little longer before they let it go. He looked at me for a long moment then, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and when he spoke again his voice had gone quieter, almost private, as though the words were meant more for himself than for me. I don't want to be the kind of man who needs to feel the shape of his own generosity, he said. I would rather simply be generous and forget I had been, the way a fire doesn't remember warming a room. It only warms it because that is its nature, not because it wants thanking for the warmth. That is a fine thing to want to be. Wanting it and managing it are two different labors, he said. I fail at it more often than I'd like. Tonight, at least, I don't think I have. No, I agreed. Tonight you haven't failed at all. Near what must have been the middle of the night, the fire burned low enough that he rose to feed it again, and in rising he passed close by where I sat, and for one unhurried moment his hand rested on the back of my chair, not touching me, simply near, and the coal in my wrist bloomed into something closer to flame, spreading warm up through my arm and settling somewhere beneath my ribs, and I looked up at him and found he was already looking down at me with an expression I had no name for. Not longing exactly, not yet, but the shape that longing takes before it knows its own name, tender and startled and a little afraid of itself. I don't know what is happening to me tonight, he said quietly. Neither do I said, but I don't want it to stop. He did not touch me then, did not so much as take my hand, only knelt by the fire and fed it wood with unusual care, and when he sat back in his chair his eyes kept finding mine across the small distance, and each time they did, the warmth in my wrist answered like an echo finding the shape that had called it. We spoke on, deeper into the night, of smaller and stranger things, of a song his mother used to hum while mending nets, though he did not say where or for whom the nets were mended, of my terror, as a girl, of the particular sound owls make just before dawn, and how I had once been convinced it was the sound of the dead calling the living out into the woods, and how my mother had sat up with me 3 nights running until I stopped being afraid of it. He told me he still could not hear an owl at dawn without a small answering chill, though he had long since made his peace with worse fears than that. I told him I had never told anyone that story, not even the man I had once thought I might marry, because it had always seemed too small and too foolish a thing to matter to anyone else. It isn't foolish, he said. It's the truest kind of thing there is, a fear a mother sat up 3 nights to cure. I think that's one of the finest stories I've ever been told, and I have been told a great many stories by a great many people trying to impress me. I wasn't trying to impress you. I know, he said. That's exactly why it worked. For a while after that, We simply listened to the storm together, not speaking, and I found I did not mind the silence any more than I had minded the talking, which surprised me, because I had spent so much of my life uneasy in quiet rooms, as though silence were a debt I would eventually be asked to repay with some cheerful noise. It did not feel that way with him. It felt like the kind of quiet two people can only share once they have already proven to each other that the talking, when it comes, will be worth the waiting. "May I ask you something that isn't kind exactly?" I said eventually, "only difficult." "You may ask me anything you like. I reserve the right not to answer, but I promise I won't pretend the question wasn't asked. You said you've made a study of very little besides trusting your own judgment over a crowd's comfort. That's not an idle turn of phrase. Something taught you that, and taught it to you hard." "What was it?" He set his cup down with the particular care of a man buying himself a moment to choose his words, and for the first time that night he looked, briefly, older than I had first taken him for, not in the lines of his face, but in something behind the eyes, a tiredness worn in like a groove in stone. "I once listened to a council of very wise, very cautious men," he said, "when my own instinct told me they were wrong, because I did not yet trust myself enough to overrule a room full of gray heads who had all the confidence I lacked. It cost lives. Not many, by the accounting such things are usually given, but even one is a great many to the people who loved that one, and I have never again mistaken a chorus of confident voices for the same thing as truth. I trust my own judgment now, not out of arrogance, but because I have already paid once for the alternative, and I did not care for the bill." "I'm sorry," I said, and meant it plainly, without reaching for anything grander to say beside it. "So am I," he said, "but I would rather carry that sorrow honestly than pretend it never happened for the sake of looking unshaken in front of a stranger by a fire. You asked a difficult question. I would rather give you a difficult answer than a comfortable lie. That's the second time tonight you've told me you'd rather give me something true and uncomfortable than something false and pleasant." "I imagine it won't be the last," he said, and the corner of his mouth lifted, rueful, warm. "I seem to have decided, somewhere in the last hour, that you are a woman worth being honest with, even when honesty costs a little more than silence would." Somewhere past that, in the hush that follows a long unburdening, he reached over without quite seeming to decide to do it and set two fingers, light as a snowflake landing, against the inside of my wrist, not holding, barely touching, as though asking a question he did not yet have words for. The warmth beneath his fingers surged up to meet him like a flame finding a wick, and beneath his own skin, at the same instant, a matching light kindled, faint, gold, no larger than a coin, pulsing once, twice, in the rhythm of a heartbeat that was somehow both his and mine together. We both looked down at it in silence, the small stubborn glow at both our wrists, undeniable now, impossible to explain away as chance or fever or the trick of firelight. "I don't know what this is," he said, and his voice had gone rough, "but I know I have never wanted anything the way I want to understand it. Not power, not name, not anything I've ever been given for what I am rather than for who I chose to be tonight. Only this, only you, exactly as you've been sitting across this fire from me since you broke down my door." "I didn't break it down," I said absurdly, because some part of me needed to say something ordinary in the face of something so entirely extraordinary. "I merely used it with great enthusiasm." He laughed, and the laugh cracked slightly in the middle, as though it had feeling behind it too large for the sound to hold, and he did not let go of my wrist, and I did not want him to. "Nessa," he said, and my name in his mouth had changed somehow in the hours since I'd first given it to him, had gathered weight, had become a thing he seemed almost reverent to be allowed to say. "Whatever tonight has done to us, and I think it has done something neither of us asked for and neither of us can yet name, I want you to know that I have not once, in all these hours, wanted anything from you that you did not also want to give. If this frightens you, tell me, and I will let it be only a night by a fire between two travelers, and I will carry it that way for the rest of my life without a single complaint. It doesn't frighten me, I said, and found, saying it, that it was entirely true. It feels like the first honest thing that has ever happened to me. We sat like that a long while, his fingers still light against my wrist, the twin marks glowing low and steady between us like two small lamps that had decided, of their own accord, to burn for each other. And outside the wind at last began to gentle, the fury going out of it by degrees, as though the storm itself had only ever been waiting for us to arrive at this. It was near dawn. The window had gone from black to the deep blue that comes just before first light, when we heard boots on the frozen step outside, and voices, low and urgent, and a fist at the door that was not the door I had come through. "My lord," a man's voice called, muffled by wood and wind. "My lord, forgive the hour the northern watch sent word. We feared the storm had taken the pass entirely. We have been searching every cabin at Imberlin since midnight." Dorian was on his feet at once, and something in his bearing changed as he crossed to the door. Not unkindness, never that, but a settling of old habit back into his shoulders. The way a man puts on a coat he has worn so long he no longer notices its weight until he has spent one evening finally without it. He opened the door to three men in plain traveling cloaks who went to one knee in the snow the moment they saw his face, heads bowed, breath clouding. "My Lord King," the foremost said, "Alpha King Dorian, thank every star in the sky we feared the worst." I do not know what my own face did in that moment. I know only that I sat very still on the bench by the dying fire, the blanket still around my shoulders, my wrist still warm with a light that had not yet faded, and looked at the man I had spent the whole night speaking to as an equal, as a stranger with a tired heart and a gentle way of pouring tea, and understood all at once that he was the Alpha King of this whole country, the man whose name was spoken in every hall from the coast to the mountains, and that he had let me shout at him about a door and laugh at his jokes, and tell him about owls at dawn, without once telling me so. He turned back to me before he answered his men, and there was something almost like fear in his face, not fear of me, I understood later, but fear of what I would become in my own eyes now that I knew, fear that the ease between us would curdle into the deference he had spent one whole night finally escaping. "Nessa," he said, quiet enough that only I could hear it under the wind, "I did not lie to you. I only did not yet say the whole of it. Every word I gave you by this fire I gave you as a man, not as a king. I would understand if that changes anything for you now." I looked at the light still glowing faint at my own wrist, then at his, matched and steady, and thought of every hour of that long night. The tea handed over like a gift, the story of the owls met with such uncomplicated gentleness, the fingers laid against my wrist not to claim but to ask, and understood that whatever this bond was, it had not answered to a crown. It had answered hours before either of us had a name to put to what was happening, long before guards knelt in the snow, to nothing grander than a tired man being honest with a stranger by a fire. "It doesn't change what happened," I said. "It only tells me what to call the kind of man you were the whole time." Something in his face broke open with relief, unguarded in a way I suspected very few had ever been permitted to see, and he came back across the small room to me, kneeling by the bench so that we were level with each other rather than above and below, and took my hand, not my wrist now, my whole hand, in both of his, careful, as though I were something he had been trusted with rather than something he had claimed. "Then let me say the rest properly," he said. "I am Dorian, Alpha King of the Northern Holds, and I have spent 9 years being married to duty and to nothing else, because no bond ever answered for me, and I had begun to believe none ever would. I broke no door tonight. You did that. But I think you broke something else besides, something I had built up around myself brick by careful brick, so that no one could ever again get near enough to see what was underneath it. I did not expect a snowstorm to be the thing that finally let someone in." The guards at the door had gone still and silent, eyes lowered with the particular discretion of men who understand they are witnessing something not meant for report. And beyond them, the sky had gone the pale gray of true dawn, snow lying deep and untouched and glittering faintly where the very first light touched it. 9 years, I repeated softly. 9 years of councils and crowns and no bond answering, and you spend one night trapped by a snowstorm with a woman who broke down the wrong door, and this is where it finally chooses to happen. I have turned it over in my mind these last few minutes, waiting for you to look at me the way strangers look at kings, and I find I still cannot make it make any sense by the ordinary reckoning, he said. Perhaps it was never going to make sense by the ordinary reckoning. Perhaps it only needed a door with no crest on it, and a fire with no throne beside it, and a woman too cold and too honest to care what title was sitting across from her. I didn't know to care, I said. That's rather the whole of it, isn't it? I couldn't have flattered a king even if I'd wanted to, because I didn't know I was in the room with one. That is precisely why I believe it, he said low. I have been flattered by experts, Nessa. I have been courted by women who rehearsed their charm in front of looking glasses before they ever saw my face. None of it ever so much as stirred the quiet in me. You asked me what I wanted that I'd never said aloud, and you meant the question, and something in me that had been asleep for 9 years simply woke up and answered you before I had given it permission to. One of the kneeling guards shifted, and Dorian glanced toward them, then back to me, something almost apologetic in the look, as though he begrudged the world outside the cabin for arriving at all. They'll want me back at the hold by midday, he said. There will be reports and councils and 100 small urgent matters that have piled up in my absence, and none of it will care in the slightest that I spent the night discovering something I'd stopped believing in. But none of that changes what already happened here. I only ask that you let me prove it to you again tomorrow, and the day after, rather than asking you to take one night's wonder entirely on faith. I'm not asking for proof, I said. I already have it. I touched the faint warmth still glowing at my wrist. I only wonder what happens now, to an ordinary weaver who broke into a king's room by accident. Nothing happens to her that she does not choose for herself, he said, and it was the plainest vow he had made all night, plainer than anything grander might have been. I did not build whatever tonight built between us so that I could spend tomorrow undoing your choices for you. Whatever comes next, it comes because you want it to, at whatever pace you want it to come. That much, at least, a king can promise as easily as a stranger by a fire could. I came through the wrong door, I said, looking only for somewhere warm to wait out a storm. I know, he said, and smiled, and it was the same smile from hours before, the one that had first surprised him as much as it had surprised me. I am beginning to think it was the only door that would ever have worked. I did not answer him with vows, because the morning was too new and too fragile a thing for vows, and because I had learned enough in one long night to know that whatever this was between us did not need grand words to be true. Only the small, honest ones we had already spent hours giving each other freely, before either of us had anything to gain by it. Outside, the guards waited with the patience of men accustomed to waiting on greater matters than their own comfort, and the snow lay clean and bright across the whole silent valley, and somewhere behind us the fire that had burned all night without either of us quite noticing how completely it had changed everything finally, gently, began to gutter down toward morning. He did not let go of my hand to stand. He drew me up with him instead, so that I rose the same moment he did, neither of us above the other, and for a while longer we simply stood there together at the threshold between the night that had made us and the day that would now have to learn what to call us, and I found that I was in no hurry at all to cross it.